to the lectern, I must say. I've seen him just hardly able to walk. As soon as he walks, he steps up. He's got more energy than MC Hammer. There it goes. There it goes. There it goes. That's it. That's it right there. That's it right there.
So I will begin today's class. And my plan is to address three moments in the history of the United States. In the hope of inferring from this discussion of the American experience lessons that can inform our exploration of the alternative futures of the country. First, the formative period of the United States between its independence and the Civil War. Then, at greater length, the remarkable episode of the New Deal, the last great moment of institutional reconstruction in the United States. And finally, in most detail, the situation generated in the closing decades of the 20th century and today. The formative period in American history. In the first half of the 19th century, the vast majority of men in the United States were either self-employed or slaves. That was the society that Tocqueville describes. The country was built by a very particular dynamic that is not widely recognized and that is in some respects in contradiction to what subsequently became the dominant political economic ideology in the United States. The formation of the United States in this early period, its building as a country, can be seen to a large extent as the resultant of two vectors, as the combination of two movements, a movement above and a movement below. Above, there was a Hamiltonian project of the large-scale mobilization of physical, economic, financial, and human resources to build the country. Down through Abraham Lincoln, almost all the presidents of the United States regarded themselves as disciples of Alexander Hamilton. So this project had a literal, physical aspect, opening up the frontier of the United States, developing its transport structure. It established the public debt and used the public debt as an instrument for this nation building, for the financing of public activity, and its agent was an informal collection of politicians, bureaucrats, entrepreneurs, and adventurers, a clique. And without understanding that movement from above, the use of the state, of the nation state, to build a country, we can't comprehend what happened. But if that had been the only dynamic, the United States would not have become what it became. There was a second important element alongside African slavery. And that second element was the selective democratization of the country, of its economy, in what were then the most important sectors of its economic life: agriculture and finance. I referred to this last week. The powers of the state were used to help build a family-scale agriculture that was the most efficient that had ever appeared in the world up to that point. And it depended on what, in a contemporary vocabulary, we would call decentralized strategic coordination between the government, the national and the local governments, and the family farmer, as well as on cooperative competition among the family farmers. And in finance, the central instrument of the nascent financial plutocracy, the National Bank, was dissolved, and the Americans proceeded to develop the most decentralized system of credit that had ever existed in the world. They were not then regulating the market. They were creating types of market that had never existed before. They were innovating in the institutional and legal content of the market order to the end of decentralizing economic opportunity and initiative. So my first thesis with respect to this formative period is that the achievement of the United States in this early period is to be credited to a large extent to this remarkable combination of forced mobilization from above and selective democratization below. The enormous potential of this combination to remain the enduring framework of American life was, however, limited by two great constraints: the constraint of thought and the constraint of politics. At no moment did the selective democratization become the object of a doctrine that would say the market economy has no single necessary and natural form. It can be created in many different forms, with many different regimes of contract and property. And some of these forms will allow for a much more radical widening of opportunity than others. The contrary happened. Over time, the market order was naturalized, and the predominant forms of thought in the two crucial institutional disciplines, economics and law, gravitated to the idea, the false idea, that the market economy has a predetermined institutional and legal content. And one particular version of the market order was then sanctified and immunized against challenge. The second great constraint on this fertile dynamic was politics. The constitutional arrangements of the United States, and more widely, its political institutions and practices, established what we might describe as a proto-democratic liberalism, fragmenting power, but limiting the degree of direct popular engagement in political life, perpetuating impasse deliberately when it arose between the political branches, and failing to exploit the experimentalist potential of the federal system to create countermodels of the national future. The market does not define its own presuppositions. The presuppositions of the market are defined outside the market in thought and in politics, and then expressed as law. Our interests and ideals are always nailed to the cross of the institutions and practices that represent them in fact. And the law is the site of this crucifixion. So the vast transformative potential of this dynamic was limited by these two constraints. The result is that in subsequent American history, the dynamic reappeared at many moments, for example, in the period after the Civil War, in early 20th century progressivism, and then again in the New Deal. But always limited, and ever more limited or ever weaker as a result of these two restrictive forces. And then, in the vacuum opened up by this weakening of the dynamic, what steps in is the marriage of political power to the corporate and financial interests, or corporate power as guided and organized by high finance. Its significance, its influence, is directly related to the weakening of that dynamic as the result of these two restrictive forces. Now I go on to the second moment that I want to address, the New Deal, the long New Deal. From Roosevelt's coming to power to the immediate aftermath of the Second World War after Roosevelt's death. It is, as I say, the last great moment of institutional reconstruction in the history of the country. And there is now the tendency of the progressives in the United States, the progressives who have no project, to look back to this earlier project sentimentally, to idealize it. We have to understand it without idealizing it. We can distinguish four moments in this long New Deal. The first moment was the earliest moment of institutional experimentalism. But it was an institutional experimentalism of a very particular kind. Its central theme was not the democratization of economic opportunity. It was the restabilization of the economy. And the major mechanism that it embraced to restabilize the economy was what the New Dealers themselves described as concerted action between government, the state, and private business. A series of deals that in today's vocabulary we would call corporatism. That was the main objective. And the uncomfortable truth is that similar programs, very similar programs, were established in all the rich North Atlantic societies at that time. Both the democratic ones and the despotic ones. If you look, for example, at the economic programs of the earliest years of Hitler's regime, they very closely resemble many of these programs established by the early New Deal. Corporatism, concerted action, supplemented by the direct employment of jobless workers by the government through work fronts. That was the first stage, and it was combated. It had its enemies in the United States and a very uneven record of achievement. It then gave way to a second moment, which you could call the mature New Deal. From a year and a half after Roosevelt's coming to power to the Second World War. And in this mature New Deal, the focus narrowed from the early corporatist institutional experimentalism to the provision of safeguards against economic insecurity, of which the most important example was the Social Security program. The institutional experimentation remained alive only in a particular domain, which was the organization of the housing market, where a whole new set of arrangements was established that laid the basis for the secondary mortgage market for widespread home ownership in the United States, the premises of the later financial system of the capital markets in the country. Then comes the third moment. The third moment is the least understood, and in some way, the most exemplary. The third moment was the war economy. Now, the Second World War was the closest thing to total war that the world has ever experienced. And what happened in the war economy is that the Americans, supposedly devoted to this sacrosanct ideology of how to organize a market economy, cast it off as if it were just a mask and organized their economy on a completely different principle. Through a freewheeling coordination between the government, especially through the instrumentality of the War Production Board and big businesses, the attempt to include small business in the picture largely failed. Prices were controlled. And in what may seem almost incredible to Americans today, the top marginal rate of the personal income tax came to exceed 90%. So this was an economy run on completely different principles, exploiting a remarkable characteristic of the United States, its ability to cooperate, and to cooperate across lines. One of the benefits of the great detriment of the denial of class. They pretended to some extent that they were all in it together. And as I said last week, in 4 years, GDP in the United States doubled. There has never been such a sensational episode of economic success, based on the denial, on the inversion of the institutional principles supposedly sacrosanct in the country. But the war economy was then treated as if it were only for the conditions of wartime. And there was never the project of imagining a war economy without a war. Then comes the fourth moment of the long New Deal afterwards. And that is the focus on the popularization of consumption, on mass consumption. On mass consumption as the salient form of the democratization of the economy, and at the same time as the way to keep the economy growing. And it was prefigured much earlier. Not long before his death, Franklin Roosevelt was asked what book he would most like to see in the hands of every Soviet child. And his interrogator expected that he would say the Holy Bible, but he said the Sears Roebuck catalog. Now, some remarks about this experience of the long New Deal. First, on the positive side, the most insightful remark ever made about the New Deal is that all of Roosevelt's programs failed, but that the New Deal as a whole was a success. And the explanation of this enigma is that a transformative project is not like what many Americans today think it's like. It's not a heap of discrete practical solutions to different problems of a technical character. It's a direction. And what matters is the direction and the fecundity of the moves. All of them are flawed. All of them are relatively fungible. They replace one another quickly. It's like a current, a waterfall. And it has as its reverse side the construction of its base. It doesn't take its base for granted. Its base doesn't antecede it. It builds its own base as it goes along in this current. But what we also see in the experience of the New Deal is the force of those restraints that became apparent in the earlier episode of the first half of the 19th century, of thought and of politics. Roosevelt wanted to be a radical experimentalist. He said so directly. But in the end, everyone is hostage to the ideas that are available to them. And those were the ideas of concerted action, of restabilization in the economy. And he had to work with constitutional arrangements which were designed to inhibit the political transformation of the social and economic order, and to establish a kind of table of correspondences between the transformative ambition of a political project and the severity of the constitutional obstacles they would have to overcome. Now then I come to the third moment. Now, the immediate past. And the intellectual and political situation arising from it. In the closing decades of the 20th century, the United States ceased to have any strategy of economic growth, except for a strategy defined by the following two elements. The first element can be summarized in a single phrase or in two words: easy money. A strategy of economic growth was subcontracted to the central bank, to the Federal Reserve, by all of the political forces in the United States. The second, the twin foundation of the growth strategy of the United States, was mass consumption, coming from the last moment of the New Deal. But here is a problem. In the closing decades of the 20th century, for reasons that I'll next discuss, the United States experienced a violently regressive redistribution of income and wealth. Mass consumption requires the dissemination of purchasing power. How did the Americans manage to reconcile this regressive redistribution of income with the maintenance of and the deepening of mass consumption? Part of the answer consists in this: that they replaced the idea of a property-owning democracy by the mechanism of a fake credit democracy. The democratization of credit, made possible in part by the overvaluation of the housing stock as collateral. The housing stock, thanks to the institutional experiments of the New Deal. And that was part of the background to the financial and economic crisis of 2008. Now then, in this latter part of the 20th century, there was a fateful change in the character of the most advanced practice of production. Mass production, industrial mass production, the large-scale production of standardized goods and services by rigid machines and production processes on the basis of semi-skilled labor in very hierarchical and specialized relations of production, ceased to be the economic vanguard. And it was replaced by something else that we call the innovation economy, or the knowledge economy, or the new economy. Dense in knowledge and technology, radically experimentalist. But this new economy, although it appeared in every part of the production system, appeared in every part only as a fringe, excluding the vast majority of businesses and of workers. Instead of being disseminated, it became more and more confined. And those who control this new economy found ways to transform parts of the production process into commodities, into routines, which they then subcontracted to workers and firms in other parts of the world where wages were lower and the tax take was also lower. So then there was a deepening of the hierarchical segmentation of the economy, of the division between the advanced and backward parts, with a double consequence for the limitation of economic growth or the rise of productivity, because the most productive practice was denied to the majority. And inequality, because inequality is rooted in the organization of the economy. The attempt to attenuate inequality after the fact through progressive taxation and redistributive social entitlements could not reach the level necessary to deal with these immense disparities anchored in the organization of the system of production. Now, this hierarchical segmentation of the economy, this confinement, then placed mass production in the circumstance of being either a leftover without a future, or just a sidekick to the new vanguard, a satellite to it within the country or more often outside the country. The insular knowledge economy was accompanied in the United States, as it is in much of the world, by a fundamental change in the condition of labor vis-a-vis capital. The middle parts of the job structure were hollowed out, and circumstances of precarious employment came to characterize larger and larger parts of the labor force. The situation of labor vis-a-vis capital degenerated. And at the same time, the hierarchical segmentation was accompanied by the financialization of the American economy, financial hypertrophy. The relation of finance to the real economy, to the production system, was loosened. The production system finances itself in large part through the retained and reinvested earnings of private firms. Finance is largely indifferent to the real economy in good times and destructive in bad times. And what would seem to be the central responsibility of finance, which is investment in innovation, in the most radical and disruptive innovation, turned out to represent only a minuscule part of the total activities of the capital markets. Now, what was the response of the progressives to this situation? They never invented a sequel to Roosevelt's agenda. Instead of a sequel to Roosevelt's agenda, they did the following. First, they acquiesced, together with the conservatives, in that double basis of economic growth, easy money and mass consumption increasingly based on debt and credit inside the country, and on the financing of the American deficits by Chinese surpluses of capital and trade. And each of these large powers use these trade relationships as a way of exempting themselves from the task of transformation. The United States, exempting itself from the responsibility for a new productivist project. China, to exempt itself from the need to deepen its internal market and organize a radical redistribution among classes, sectors, and regions. It was an escape valve. Then the progressives, as a proxy, as a substitute for the productivist project that they didn't have, the structural project, at election time would genuflect to progressive taxation as a way of showing whose side they're on. Now, progressive taxation and the social entitlements that it may fund can be very important as a way of establishing the basis for investment in people and their capabilities. But all over the world, it has only a marginal effect on fundamental inequality. To change the reality of inequality, you need to have initiatives that intervene in the institutional arrangements that define the original or fundamental distribution of economic and educational advantage and opportunity. You can't just correct it after the fact. Third, the progressives deepened the racial orthodoxy in the United States, which was to treat race as separate from class, as a threshold issue, through a series of programs like affirmative action, that on the whole generated benefits inversely proportional to the need, more for the black professional bourgeoisie than for the black working class, more for the black working class than for the black underclass, and alienating, estranging, offending the white working class majority of the country that came to see itself as the victim of a sanctimonious conspiracy between the economic and political elites and the putative representatives of the beneficiaries of these programs. And this whole principle was then generalized in the form of what later came to be called identity politics. At the same time, the progressives intervened in the moral and spiritual religious debate in the United States, which there was a contest of two moral agendas. To my mind, speaking just independently, both of them primitive. And they attempted to establish one agenda, the so-called secular or modernist agenda, against the other agenda, the so-called traditionalist or religious agenda, by entrenchment in the Constitution, reinterpretation of the Constitution, and federal law. Now then, the formula of power in the United States by which the conservatives won and maintained power, reduced to its simplest elements, was this. It consisted in combining material concessions to the interests of the moneyed classes with accommodation to the moral concerns of the classes without money. And in this circumstance that I've described, this turned out to be for a time, a successful strategy. Except, of course, that could not resolve the real problems, the everyday economic problems of the working class majority, including the white working class majority. So then there's a second wave of what you could call a plutocratic populism, which says, no, yes, we'll directly deal with these problems of the white working class majority. But it deals with them only in a very oblique and limited and ineffective form, defensively, through restraints on migration, or through the attempt to win a few more years for a kind of mass production industry that has no future. And as it has no economic program, it has no constitutional program other than a strengthening of executive authority. It's just a kind of holding operation. It's a liquefaction with no enduring structural content, a tremendous opportunity for the progressives if they had a program, but they don't. And then comes the question then, with which I want to conclude my argument, about what, again, the outlines of such a program would be. In the economic sphere, it couldn't address just the demand side of the economy. It would have to address as well the supply side. It has to be a productivist project, among other things. And more generally, it has to deal with empowerment, and not just with the central obsession of the New Deal, security and stabilization. So its characteristic has to be to have a response to each of those three structural problems that I described. The relation of the vanguard, now the knowledge economy, to the rest. So that this abyss between them can be bridged. The relation of finance to the real economy, so that finance can be enlisted in the service of production rather than allowed to serve itself. Finance can be a good servant, but it's always a bad master. And the relation of labor to capital, so that a new set of laws, of institutions, masters this new reality of decentralized and unstable contractual employment, and prevents flexibility from becoming a euphemism for radical economic insecurity for the majority. That would have to be the core of the political economy of the progressive project. Second, it requires elevation of the tax take. So the American state, at all levels of the federal system, takes in the aggregate more than 10% less than the European social democracies, for example. There's no solution, there's no alternative, economically or educationally, that is consistent with this tax take. But to raise significantly the tax take, you have to do something that the American progressives, who prefer pietistic gestures to transformative consequences, do not accept. And that is to understand that in the short run, a substantial and sustainable elevation of the tax take can be based only on the use of the regressive and indirect taxation of consumption, as through the comprehensive flat rate value-added tax, which is the basis of tax systems in most of the world. The tax that is neutral with respect to the system of relative prices, and that therefore allows the state to take in the greatest amount of resources with the least economic disturbance. And then everything that is lost by way of progressivity on the revenue-raising side is gained in double on the spending and investment side. The third element in the progressive project would have to be a concerted attack on the educational dualism that exists in the United States. The counterpart to economic opportunity is educational opportunity. So there are two different school systems in the United States. There's a school system still for the majority of most of the public schools that train students, future workers, in discipline, in rote discipline, for a kind of economic life that is ceasing to exist. And then there's another school system of the private schools, of the top tier of the public schools, that is analytical, selective, cooperative, but rejects the other part of John Dewey's program, which is criticism. And instead of criticism, it trains the young in the perfection of a certain style of sociability, like the cheerful, impersonal friendliness, the self-denying charisma that is regarded as useful to operation in the American professional and business class. An attack on this educational dualism in a country that is large, unequal, and federal. Local management of the schools has to be combined with national standards of investment in quality. And the content of education has to be not only analytical and cooperative, but also dialectical, always from opposing points of view. The fourth element in this project is to change the way of thinking about the relation between race and class, so that they're combined. And there are many different ways of combining them. I'll just give you an extreme example. Separate out the issue of individualized racial discrimination and criminalize it, as it is in many countries around the world. And then deal with the structural problem, the existence of groups in society that find themselves caught in a circumstance of disadvantage and exclusion from which they are unable to escape by the means of collective action that are available to them. And then there have to be policies of advancement for those groups, defined by the existence of actual disadvantage and actual exclusion that characteristically arises from the combination of different forms of disadvantage, such as race and class. And fifth, the progressives would have to abandon their attempt to impose by law and by constitutional interpretation their moral agenda on the majority of the American people, and allow the dialectic, the conflict between these two relatively primitive and heartless moral agendas to go on, in the hope that it would result in the moral improvement of the people, in their enlightenment. Well, this is the sketch of an alternative way to respond to the historical situation, informed by these lessons of American experience. It has a central theme. The central theme is the enhancement and the democratization of agency. Empowerment, the capacity to act within, beyond, and against the context. Not through the actions of a few isolated and lucky individuals, but collectively. And it is therefore related to the sublime message of the American prophets. Let's become bigger together.
My prayers were answered. Brother Unger's voice held out. This is a great eloquence and passion, as is not just often, but always the case. I want to begin at a very, very rudimentary level. I want to give you a sense of the lens that I use to look at the American democratic experiment, which begins with some very elementary philosophical assumptions. I begin with the undeniable and inescapable realities of being human, the kind of primates that we are, the kind of animals that we are, the kind of human beings that we are. Namely, the forms of death, the forms of dogma, and the forms of domination that we have to come to terms with from womb to tomb. And what I mean by that is that America must be looked at not as some exceptional social project, city on a hill, dropped from heaven, but part of a larger human history of empires driven by forms of xenophobia, be it white supremacy, male supremacy, anti-Jewish, anti-Arab, anti-Muslim, anti-gay, lesbian, anti-trans, anti-physically challenged. We're part of a larger human project in which we're trying to sustain a very, very fragile, and I would even say precious, set of democratic practices that have always been circumscribed by forms of death, forms of dogma, and forms of domination that we are usually in denial about. Now, forms of death, of course, are physical, we're all going to go, but I'm talking about social death of slavery, the imperial death of indigenous peoples, the civic death of Jim and Jane Crow. You're in the society, but you're not a citizen. You have no civic participatory possibilities. And of course, the psychic and the spiritual death of believing that you're less than, less moral, less beautiful, less intelligent, or most importantly, that you feel as if you have very good grounds for being fearful and scared and intimidated, and therefore prone to self-doubt and self-disrespect. That's precisely what white supremacy does, precisely what male supremacy does, precisely what homophobia does, precisely what transphobia does. So in talking about democracy, what we don't want to do is just jump right in and say, lo and behold, we've got democratic visions, we've got practices that we have to conform to what is articulated in the Constitution and Declaration of Independence. And the last thing we want to do is to view other forms of domination as if they're just deficits in the U.S. democracy. Because you already are missing out on the larger picture, which is a humanizing picture. And of course, anytime you humanize, you contextualize. And when you contextualize, you pluralize. When you pluralize, you individualize, acknowledge the unique singular individuals who are shaped by various traditions and heritages vis-a-vis various ideological structures of education, the ways in which the political economy provides only certain kinds of options, the relation of that political economy with the nation state and how it's changing over time. Now this is a whole lot to keep track of. And it goes radically against our neoliberal university. Because given the disseminated division of knowledge, we don't have a sense of the synoptic overarching view. You get socialized into economics over here, sociology here, government here, computer science here, physics here, chemistry here. What does the whole force look like? I don't know, but the nut I've been shining is pretty shiny. Good for your career, bad for truth. Bad for your soul, because you're still a full organic primate. You're still a full-fledged human being who has to learn how to connect the existential and the economic, the social and the spiritual, the personal and the political. And of course, the relation to those who came before. Now, what I bring to my views of the development of American democracy over time, both past, present, and future, is the very rich Socratic legacy of Athens. Socrates matters mustering the courage to examine yourself, your society, your world, makes a big difference. And so it is with the prophetic legacy of Jerusalem. Amos, Esther, Jesus, Muhammad matter. Because if you look at the world through the lens of trying to connect truth to the spreading of Hesed, of steadfast love and loving kindness, especially to the vulnerable, especially to the fatherless and motherless and orphans and oppressed and subjugated and those whose humanity is rendered invisible, forgotten, overlooked, pushed to the side, then you're going to miss out on a whole understanding of how America came to be. The very conditions for the possibility of America. The genocide of indigenous peoples, the African slavery, the white brothers with no property, white working class males who could not participate in the political system, the Jews who were marginalized because it was a Protestant project, the Catholics who were demonized, it was a Protestant project. And of course, the patriarchal households and the vicious attacks on the vast majority of Americans who were women. And this is not PC chit-chat. This is trying to keep track of the truth or truths of the making of America. There's the scientific legacy of the Enlightenment, which, of course, there's scientific dogmas, just like there are religious dogmas. There's ideological dogmas. There's a whole host of different kinds of dogmas, but dogmas are inescapable. Sooner or later, you're going to arrive on a dogma. It's true. As a Christian myself, my dogma is every human being made in the image of God, every child has the same status no matter what country they're from. I hold on to that dogma for dear life. The scientists could come along and say, I think you ought to be more improvisational and begin to question that dogma because you claim to be part of the Socratic legacy of enlightenment. I said, that's true, but I'm holding on to this dogma because that has to do with the conception of myself. Like talking about the love of my mama. It's non-negotiable. Based on experience, but I'm just being honest. You see, there's certain things you have to take a stand on. Draw the line in the sand. You see. But then the fourth tradition is very important, is the blues legacy of black people in this country. The blues is narratives of catastrophe lyrically expressed with style and a smile. So you look at the world through the lens of the chronic catastrophes, not just of black people, of human beings wrestling with whatever forms of catastrophe take. It could be the strange fruit that Billie Holiday sings about, and the Jewish Mariposa singing, providing the lyrics, you see. The catastrophe of American terrorism, of lynching, of Jim and Jane Crow. It could be the catastrophe of working peoples who don't have the right to organize until the Wagner Act of 1935, 100 years after Argentina. And I love Argentina, but it's not known for being on the cutting edge of the struggle for social justice. We're 100 years behind, but no, we're the city on the hill. We saw this the other day with all of our sisters in white connected to the great feminist movement. You see, Donald Trump says, oh, look at all the women elected. It's such a beautiful thing. And they all stand up as if somehow this is only in America. Women have been running countries all around the world. America's yet to do that, but somehow we always on the moral cutting edge. Wake up, get off the crack pipe. USA, please. So childish, so parochial, so provincial. Where is your understanding of the forms of death and dogma and domination over time so that we're one crucial, distinctive national project alongside others, but rooted in this genocide, rooted in the slavery, rooted in the patriarchal households, rooted in the anti-Jewish, anti-Catholic realities, and yet we have been able to generate some kinds of dialogue in the face of those dogmas. And those dialogues primarily have been social movements. If you look at America primarily through its institutional arrangements, you're going to miss the fundamental role of the social movement. The abolitionist movement only had a few thousand rooted right here, William Lloyd Garrison and David Walker, Mariah Stewart, and a host of others, a few thousand, Harriet Beecher Stowe, they were the ones saying what? I look in the U.S. Constitution and I notice you make no reference to a catastrophe called slavery. Sooner or later, those kind of chickens are going to come home to roost. And the most important event in the history of the country, which is a civil war, you're going to end up losing 750,000 precious folk fighting over an institution not invoked in your Constitution. That's called denial. That's called avoidance. That's called evasion. Because you don't want to be Socratic enough to examine this dogma of white supremacy. You don't want to be courageous enough to look at this form of social death in your midst. The 22% of those who are producing the commodities, that's the precondition for any of your talk about democracy. Without their labor, there wouldn't even be the possibility of any talk about democracy. Wouldn't be a Harvard Law without those crimes. Wouldn't be a Wall Street without those crimes, you see. How do you keep track of these forms of death and dogma and domination? Imperial domination, capitalist domination. We were in China and the Soviet Union, it would be communist domination. Ecclesiastical forms of domination, ideological forms, educational forms, all of these different forms bombarding us as human beings. And we somehow have to come up with conceptions of ourselves and the world to accent that sublimity that Brother Unger talked about. The democratic ideal, believing fundamentally that human beings have the capacity to govern themselves. It is a Pascalian wager. You take a wager on the capacity and the abilities of those Sly Stone called everyday people to govern themselves, to raise their voices and shape their destinies, to play fundamental role in the institution-making processes that guide and regulate their life. That's one of the reasons why democracy is so rare. That's why I started last week with Plato and Dostoevsky. Plato said, Brother West, it's a pipe dream. Appreciate your effort. Dostoevsky, I resonate with you, but I don't believe human beings even have the capacity to be Socratic and prophetic enough to really think that they would sacrifice their own narcissism, their own egoism, to actually produce a larger common good, a larger public interest. That line again, the Iceman comes, or the foolosopher, Larry, sitting at Harry Hope's saloon, said, human beings can never produce a democracy, let alone be concerned of interrogating themselves, because they're too greedy, and they're never willing to give up that greed, which is the price of liberty. And you say, Plato, Dostoevsky, Eugene O'Neill, appreciate the Socratic challenge. Now let's look at the history of any corner of the world, but we're beginning with the United States. Let's look at the history of the United States and see how the best of those who wanted to sustain this democratic project tried to muster the courage to be Socratic, muster the courage to be prophetic, muster the courage to look at catastrophe in the blues way, and then to use science as a weapon to try to keep track of where the power is, how it operates, who's being subordinated, who's benefited. Do we have that kind of candor? Do we have that kind of honesty? When Malcolm X came and lectured here in 1964 to the Harvard Law School, of course we know he never went to college, but college went through him. And he stood up, and what did he say? He said, sincerity is my only credentials. Honesty is my end and aim. He was speaking on behalf of profoundly Socratic people, profoundly prophetic people, an impatient people, an inquisitive people, but a blues people engaging in a sad and sweet indictment of catastrophic circumstances. He spoke as a Muslim, spoke as a black man, he spoke as a radical, a revolutionary. That kind of spirit tied to social movements, attacking any form of domination, of any slice of humanity being dominated. being subordinated, you see. And so let's look briefly at where we are, given where we have been. The abolitionists, 1787 up until 1861, giving it their all. You've never read David Walker's Appeal to Colored Citizens of the World. It's time to read it now before you die. September 28th, 1829. Thomas Jefferson, you are a founding father. You want us to read the Declaration of Independence? I'm reading your notes on Virginia. The white supremacist notes on Virginia. The ways in which that white supremacy is tied into that democratic vision that you have, and the way in which it's going to haunt you down up until 2019. 400 years black people been here, terrorized, stigmatized, hated. And yet here's David Walker, alongside Maria Stewart, alongside Sojourner Truth, alongside Harriet Tubman, saying, yes, we're terrorized, but don't worry, we're not going to terrorize you, but we're going to fight for our freedom. Yes, we've been traumatized, but we're not going to traumatize you. We're actually going to try to heal ourselves, and by that, we might even end up healing you if you get in on it. Or we're going to be chronically and systemically hated in every physical way, our bodies, our minds, our thoughts. But watch what we teach you. We're going to teach you about so much love you don't know what to do with yourself. But it's going to be that real deep kind of love. It's going to be a form of love that says, maybe if you're willing to surrender your consent to forms of social and civic death, if you're willing to interrogate your Darwins, if you're willing to take a stand against domination, you'll realize what it is to be a higher, more morally driven human being and be able to experience certain kinds of joys that you may not be able to experience if all you're concerned about is your everyday pleasures. That's the message of Martin Luther King Jr., of Fannie Lou Hamer, of John Coltrane, Nina Simone. That's what you reach out. So in talking about American democracy, this is the starting point for me, you see. And the result is what? Breaking the back of white supremacist slavery. The most barbaric of all of modern civil wars in the 19th century. 12 months in the sun, as Du Bois put it in his classic Black Reconstruction of 1935. And what happens? Here comes slavery by another name. The Union Army wins the war, white supremacy wins the peace. The president of the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis, he's born the same day I was actually, that's how history is. June the 2nd, not the exact same day, same date on the calendar. That's a Socratic moment for me though, isn't it? I got to be self-critical all the time. Me and Brother Jefferson, Lord have mercy. He goes to jail 2 years. 2 years. And when he's released in Richmond, in the same space where he reigned, who pays the bail? Cornelius Vanderbilt. Capital from the north. They want reconciliation, again, access to markets. America now tied to its corporate elites. As it continues to expand on to 50 states, imperial expansion called manifest destiny. Okay, go on and deodorize it. Typical. Sanitize it. Sterilize it. No, it's imperial expansion. You're taking people's land. There's people there. Nobody here but just Indians and buffaloes. That's what the signs read. Really. Ain't got nothing against buffaloes, but let me tell you something. Indigenous people just as precious as the ruling classes in Boston. And their babies just as priceless as the working classes in South Boston, my dear Irish brothers and sisters. That's the lens through which you look at it. And what happens from 1877 until 1965, as the American industrial machine expands, as the American imperial machine expands with Guam and Hawaii and Cuba and a whole Samoa Islands and other places, Philippines and other places. Those practices not just truncated, but related in deeply complicated but crucially discernible ways to a capitalist America run by robber barons, politicians, extensions for the most part of them, populist movements emerging, marginalized and crushed, the two political parties, both of them tied to the ruling classes. Both of them tied to the ruling classes. In the same way today, Democratic Republican Party, for the most part, tied to Wall Street. Now we got some examples, some counter voices with AOC. Yes, you want to say something right quick?
Dr. West, I don't mean to interrupt, but I noticed some people standing in the back and there's a seat.
Well, yeah, please come up. Well, we got one seat for about 7 of you. We got some over here. I appreciate that. I appreciate that. It's a very democratic gesture. Indeed, come right in. Come right in. But the period that we're talking about, 1877 to 1965, unbelievable industrialization, urbanization, modernization of America under the auspices of what? American terrorism on the one hand, but black people are being lynched every 2.5 days for those 50 years. Where the working classes can't organize, where the women can't vote. And yet, June is busting all over economically. Economic growth, unbelievable. What is the relation between that Gilded Age, coined by one of the greatest of all of our artists, the greatest comic writer in the history of the American literary tradition, Mark Twain, called it the Gilded Age. He said American imperialism is running amok. William James himself, vice president of the Anti-Imperialist League. America has lost its soul. It has lost its moral sense. That's William James, and he's not the most radical. He lives right on Irving Street. You can see the house. We got a nice sign there. You see. He's from the well-to-do, but he's got Socratic sensibility. He's got a prophetic way of looking at the world to some significant degree. And during that period was one of the great moments of loss. If Reconstruction had been able to continue, in which there were black Supreme Court judges in South Carolina, lieutenant governors in Louisiana, 2 black senators from Mississippi, it goes on and on and on, creating a multiracial democracy as an experiment, nearly unprecedented. Shut down, military troops withdrawn. White supremacists move in, control. Klan, Citizens Council, a whole host of other white supremacist militia and groups saying, we got things under control down here, even as they coordinated with northern capitalists to bring in their capital and exploit their own white workers. We need an interpretation of America's past, connected to a social analysis of past and present, if we're going to have a radical democratic vision of the future that has any resonance, any capacity to be effectuated. And we move to Brother Unger's moment, especially the New Deal. Oh, it's so crucial. There's a very important book to read by Ira Katz Nelson, my dear brother at Columbia University, called When Affirmative Action Was White. When affirmative action was white. It's another way of saying how white supremacy continued to rule and reign even as the United States had moved now to the near center of the world stage. It had already become a crucial mover on the world stage after World War I. After World War II, of course, it will be the center of the world stage. But the New Deal is one of the most important attempts to try to gain some kind of resources to the vast majority of Americans. In 1939, 51% of Americans lived in utter poverty. Think about that. Think about that. Today it's about 22. What are you going to do? FDR's coming from the ruling classes, from Hyde Park, Harvard. You see Adams' house where he used to sit and squat. That's where he was. His behind was right there. But he was shaped and molded by something else too. Socratic legacy, prophetic legacy. Willing to speak up, So he could say something that no president, for the most part, has said since. You economic royalists, i.e. ruling class, I welcome your hate. Which is a way of saying I must be doing something right. Because I know your well, and I know your greed, I know your indifference, I know your callousness. Not all of you, but your dominant tilt. And I know your lack of concern of our foreign policies in other parts of the world where you talk about how precious everybody is, but you're willing to drop bombs on folk and not even count them, or when you do count them, they're just collateral damage. That's FDR at his best, but he couldn't break the back of Jim Crow. He couldn't break the back of American apartheid. Why not? Within his party, he's got the Southern elites. John Rankin of Mississippi, Bill Bohr, down south. There was no way he could push through the reform, the relief, the recovery required to save capitalism on the one hand and then generate the war machine to try to crush a thug named Hitler in alliance with the Soviet Union. This is something we have to continually acknowledge. Continually acknowledge. You can hate communism all you want, but when it came crushing Hitler without that Soviet army and the US Army and some other allies, we could all be speaking German. Very different story. Africa, already subordinated by vicious forms of European colonialism. 6 million dead in the Belgian Congo, hardly a mumbling word. And we get surprised when the million are in the heart of Europe. But oh, when it's somewhere else outside of Europe, oh, that's just a sad thing. I know what each one of those lies, the 6 million in Europe, precious. 6 million in Belgian Congo, precious. In other places as well. So almost 1 million in the Philippines, U.S., about 750,000 dead, and with Philippines under U.S. forces and so forth. You see. How do we keep track of this if we're really going to be honest and candid about American democracy? The ways in which the marvelous and the magnificent elements are inseparable from the barbaric and the monstrous elements. Can we keep track of all of those simultaneously? The New Deal. On the one hand, labor finally gets the right to engage in collective bargaining. 4% unionized in 10 years. It's going to be 29. It's going to reach the peak of 35% of the labor force unionized. What does that mean? It means working people for the first time can play at least some role in shaping their destiny. They don't have to worry about the Pinkertons of the Rockefellers and others. So when they strike, they get crushed violently. The Pinkertons had a militia larger than the state of Ohio just to protect the private property of the capitalists as they hired folk at will and fired at will. Deeply racist, yes, but even those racist white workers, human beings who deserve a living wage. No possibility of it till 1935. Thank God for Francis Perkins. Somebody tell me who Francis Perkins is. Who's Francis Perkins? Absolutely, absolutely. Coming out of not just the suffragist movement, but the triangle event of 1911, 146 folk crushed in the garment industry in New York City. Her connection to the organized labor movement, not just the AFL, but open even to the CIO, the unskilled workers, the masses of workers. CIO, for the first time, able to rear its head without being crushed. Its leaders in the past taken to jail. Eugene Debs on the wall of old brother Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders made a mediocre documentary of a non-mediocre brother, Eugene Debs. He sees himself in that tradition. How do you keep track of the 1% and the inability to account for the ways in which they gain assets? They have a right to live, they have liberties, yes. When their bad masters tied to Wall Street, tied to other ruling class institutions, including educational ones like Harvard, that often provides the ideological spokespersons to rationalize the denial of the catastrophe of poverty, the catastrophe of not enough wages to survive, the catastrophe of grotesque wealth inequality at the lived experience, the level of lived experience. You see. But it's also true, there was tremendous breakthroughs with the New Deal. It wasn't just the labor movement and the Wagner Act. There was various programs. You know, the federal government became the largest job program for the vulnerable, farmers, poor, elderly. But with the Southern elites, Social Security for all occupations other than agricultural laborers and domestic maids, which meant 85% of black folk never to benefit from it during that time. Intentionally designed by white supremacist elites on the congressional, chairman of congressional committees to allow for that push of the first phase of Social Security. I mean, of both Social Security and the Wagner Act. They're going to change their minds very quickly. You're going to have Taft-Hartley in 1947. States' rights to right to work, to make sure you don't unionize, especially in the South. Why not unionize in the South? Because maybe they might bring black and white workers together, and lo and behold, you're going to get civil rights activism, and that civil rights activism might dismantle Jim Crow, and in dismantling Jim Crow, you're going to be lost existentially because you're tied to white supremacist ways of viewing the world. And they were very explicit about that. So the irony is, there's no Wagner Act without the white supremacist elites, but they saw where it could lead. And 12 years later, you got Taft-Hartley continues to be at work, especially given the kind of support under Reagan, and now, of course, with Trump, it's just on steroids. Even though he talks about workers, but it's a pseudo-populism. We'll get to that before, a little later. But what am I talking about here? I'm talking about just how crucial, how difficult, and yet how indispensable it is to try to get beyond the dominant lens of the narratives about the United States. And it's not just that it's mendacious, because there have truths there, but it always denies the catastrophic. And so people can't wait to get in on the American project, mediated with the American dream, so that they too often become part of the deniers. And one of the challenges these days, and Brother Roberto was talking about that in terms of diversity, and we know that's a bureaucratic construct. Because anybody coming to terms with legacies of white supremacy and male supremacy and so forth, no, it's not a matter of diversity. You got to be far removed and distant from suffering to come up with that category. But it's played its role, going back to the Supreme Court. They said affirmative action is not about justice anymore. It's not about repair of the damage done after 244 years of slavery and 90 years of Jim and Jane Crow. We need diversity for the highly educated so they can learn to have sensitivity to the folk that don't look like them. You say, oh, I thought it was about justice. Oh, no, that's gone now. No, that right-wing court pulled the rug from under that. You expect justice from the courts? You're in the wrong business. That's not true, but I mean, I know we got lawyers and lawyers to be in here, but diversity. So in the name more and more is to what? Have black and brown and red and women. Just get in on the imperial project and celebrate about you being on the cutting edge of justice. And it is an act of justice to transgress against white supremacy, male supremacy, and so forth. You see. But if you're not concerned with the larger whole and the role of America in the world and the wealth inequality and the poverty, then what are you talking about in terms of being committed as a full-fledged Democrat, small d, trying to be Socratic and prophetic, concerned about the catastrophic, but also recognizing when you engage in a sophisticated social analysis, how can anybody be cheerful about the increase of diversity with the vast increase of inequality? What are we talking about here? Individually, we understand it. I mean, each one of you all do well. I'm going to cheer for you for at least 4 minutes. Because you're a human being. It's a beautiful thing. Put a smile on mama's face. Dad, too. Then the question becomes, what you going to do when you get in that highly diversified professional managerial slot? How is it going to be connected to the catastrophic? How is it going to be connected to poverty? How is it going to be connected to grotesque wealth inequality? How is it going to be connected to foreign policies that act as if you can just drop bombs on Muslims and call them collateral damage when they're precious like anybody else? That's the kind of challenge we're talking about. That's where the blues sensibilities of black people comes in. Because at our best, one of the reasons why they had to kill so many of us and lie about so many of us. When David Walker published in September 28, 1829, he's dead in 6 months. Got a bounty on his head, $10,000, worth $3 million today on his head. Ida B. Wells' critique of American terrorism called the Red Terror. Bounty on the head, you got to go to England for 2 months. Shoot Malcolm down, shoot Martin down, shoot Medgar down, shoot Bobby Hutton down. We can go on and on and on. The truth is too much. That's Dostoevsky. You can't take the truth. T.S. Eliot says human beings can only bear so much reality. Only a little bit of it. And so what Brother Roberto and I are talking about is something that has to be renewed every generation. Because we don't know of any full-fledged triumph of a full-fledged democracy. We fight to defend rights. We fight to defend liberties. But oftentimes even that's selective. We can get excited about some people's rights and liberties being violated. When other people's rights and liberties are violated, we don't say a mumbling word. How do we learn to be consistent in that regard? Now, where we are now, the rule of big money, the rule of big military, 53 cents of every dollar gone to the military-industrial complex under Democrats as well as Republicans. Wars taking place with no public dialogue, no public discussion, not even keeping track of the precious bodies, be it American bodies. We can't even see the American bodies when they come back from Afghanistan, when they come back from Somalia, when they come back from Niger, when they come back from Pakistan and so forth. Our drones drop. We don't even know we're dropping drones until we hit an American. As soon as you hit an American, there's Brother Barack Obama. I got a press conference right away. We didn't mean to do that, though. We're going to provide financial compensation for the whole family. We plead. We're so sorrowful about that. But wait a minute. Brennan just said that you didn't kill innocent people. Quit lying, Brennan. I mean, I don't want to just zero in on the brother. He's part of a larger collective. Quit lying, White House. And what makes you think that that American life has more value than the life of somebody in Somalia or Yemen or Afghanistan or Pakistan? And you keep track of those. Oh, Lord. We brought back members of the family. Padilla Benjamin and a host of us. Not one congressman would even come talk to them because it's outside of the narrow framework. You don't want to contest. The dogma is suffocating in that regard. You see, same thing in the Middle East, in terms of Gaza and West Bank. And we know the history of the United States when it came out Jewish brothers and sisters during World War II, turning the boats back. Thought you were fundamentally concerned about our precious Jewish brothers and sisters. You see, Trump had American soldiers coming down from heaven the other night. I said, Lord, there must be a strange God up there dropping down Americans to save our precious Jewish brothers and sisters, given the history of the United States up until 1960 or so, and mistreating Jewish brothers and sisters. Only during that period you begin to push back on these vicious anti-Jewish quotas at Harvard and Yale and Princeton and other places. 1 out of 3 jobs in America in 1940 had Christian restrictions. Rosenberg, you have no chance whatsoever. Step back. This is a Christian thing. We don't know of a Christian civilization not shot through with Jewish hatred and anti-Jewish hatred and so forth. But oh, lo and behold, America and all of its relative flexibility can make room for the Catholics. I saw that in Charlottesville. Standing right there looking at the gangster gangsters, neo-Nazi brothers. Guns loaded, gas masks. And one of them being led by David Duke, a Catholic. So that's America upward mobility. To have a Catholic running a Ku Klux Klan. It began anti-black, anti-Jewish, anti-Catholic. And I saw a black brother in the crowd too. Another confused Negro. Hey, I mean, I'm a Christian. I love everybody, but hey. I can't stand the immigrants. They're taking over. Okay, all right, okay. Don't have time for long dialogue now. Praying for you. It makes it what? A human thing, not a function of skin pigmentation. Just like it's not a function of gender, it's not a function of sexual orientation, not a function of any other quality. What kind of moral choice you make, what you're willing to sacrifice, what kind of ethical ideal informs what you are doing concerning the preserving of the democratic project. Brother Unger has been at this for almost 50 years, trying to continually raise these kinds of questions. Could have given up a long time ago. Live well and large. No, certain kind of courage, certain kind of sacrifice. So it is every generation. In the 1960s, it looked like we had a chance. Here is Lyndon Baines Johnson, growing up white supremacist in Jim Crow, Texas, going to be the president that says we shall overcome, which was the anthem of the Black Freedom Movement in the 60s to break the back of apartheid in the South. Legislation. No legislation without social movement. No legislation without keeping track of forms of death, dogma, domination. Multiracial to the core. Disproportionate Jewish on the vanilla side. Invoking prophetic legacies of Jerusalem. Over against their parents. Over against their parents. Norman Powell Horowitz was talking about making it. We Jewish folk have been tied too long with struggles for justice. We've got to learn how to make it. That was a classic in the 1960s. The major fissure sets in the Jewish community. Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel says, I'm going to march with Martin Luther King Jr. So many Jewish brothers have said, you must be losing your mind. Why would you associate with them? They are the stigmatized. He said, well, who are you? Aren't you Jewish? Don't you come out of a stigmatized condition in Europe? The Jewish catastrophe in Europe, the 1492 to 1945. Why don't you understand your struggles in connection with the stigmatized here? No, we ought to become Americans. We want to make it. We don't want to keep the faith anymore like that. We're not naive anymore. We're not part of this justice stuff that's always marginal. We outgrew that. Did you grow up or did you grow down? You may have grown rich, may have grown powerful, but did you grow up? That's what Heschel said. And he wasn't alone. Michael Lerner and a whole host of others have been saying this within the context of the Jewish community. We can say the same thing about Dorothy Day and the Catholic community on the white side of town and so forth. Now, why is all this important in terms of trying to wrestle with what we are concerned about in this class? Well, because there can be no future, the best of American democracy, but each and every one of us being very clear and honest about the lens through which we view the world, America. And most importantly, that we view ourselves. Ella Baker used to say, you are the leaders you've been looking for. You have to decide, given your own careers, what kind of lens you're going to use to look at the world. Will you be willing to come to terms with some very, very painful truths? Can we start the discussion of immigrants on how did California become USA when it was Mexico? Let's start with that framework. It still don't necessarily lead toward agreement, but being able to recognize the ways in which the U.S. policy plays a fundamental role in Central America and Mexico in terms of people being driven to desperation, and the various ways in which the targeting of so-called this slice of illegal immigrants. How many illegal immigrants come from Canada? Tons of them. Not a mumbling word from so much of the discourse. Not just on the right, including Democrats. Democrats voted for the wall too. It was just 635 rather than 1,200. And they think that's radical. Oh, those 550 really make a difference, you know. How do we keep track of both parties? Both voices. All of them not wrong, all of them not right, but just being honest. There we go. When we move to this modern moment, what do we see? Unbelievable spiritual collapse of integrity, honesty, decency. The pot horrors that's making it has become survival of the slickest. Everybody just getting over. Because the out for integrity and honesty is to push you so far to the margin. And the callousness rewarded. The lies normalized. The crimes naturalized. Repressive apparatuses in black communities, brown communities, policed, too often trigger happy. Not anything new. It's been going on year after year after year. Overwhelming despair, overwhelming paranoia. How much talk do we hear about poverty? Under Brother Barack Obama, how many times did he talk about poverty? Many of us had a poverty, anti-poverty tours and so forth. In the name of Martin King, trying to organize poor people's movements. Hardly any talk at all. But how many Wall Street executives go to jail? 0. Strong sign. You're leaning toward the powerful. Strong sign, not a talk, not a word hardly about hitting poverty head on. Not necessarily about taxes, but a whole host of creative projects. And you can rest assured, if you convince America that poverty is an issue of national security, America either says, well, we're not really concerned about national security in the same way we thought we were, or we become highly creative and highly experimental, because the only way we can reproduce ourselves is maybe do something about poverty. That's one of the reasons why when you talk about American democracy, it's no accident that so much of American history when it comes to raising these kind of issues has to do with riots, chaos-producing capacity. The ruling class is finally reaching the point where some kind of awakening takes place. 221 rebellions, April 5th, 1968, at the Martin shot down like a dog. And all of a sudden, the ruling class is saying, my God, I think we might have a problem, Harry. These Negroes have gone crazy. They love Martin, you know. The polls said that only 55% of them approved of Martin because he came out against Vietnam, was organizing poor people of all colors. But lo and behold, they really loved him much deeper than we thought, because it wasn't just a matter of policies they disagreed with. They know he really loved him. They know he sacrificed for them, and they're burning our stuff down. It wasn't the legislation that generated the response. Harvard itself did not open up Harvard to black people as a result of legislation. They opened it up because of the mass rebellions. I was in the first class that showed up. 98 of us walked through. A couple of years before, it was 9. And we didn't have any great intellectual renaissance in the black community for all of a sudden it allowed black people to get into Harvard. Like any other ruling class institution, Harvard said, my God, you know, we got to do a little better on diversity. Diversity, my so-and-so. No, you know you can't reproduce your social order without trying to bring some folk in, hopefully to pacify them in such a way that they become so well adjusted to injustice. They can't wait to get into your unjust status quo, and when they get there, they mute their voices and begin to use themselves as exemplars of success in the American dream, rather than look at the world through the vantage point of the catastrophic and where their parents came from, where their grandparents came from. Part of the design. You just read the minutes. And I'm glad Harvard let me in. I've had a good time. It's true. But I'm still very much the same decolonized, Jesus-loving, free black man I am now than I was then. I'm just more intellectually equipped with experience and some new friendships from Brazil and other places. That's very important because I happen to also be committed to the future of the American democratic project in relation to trying to dismantle its imperial policies, to allow for redistribution of wealth given the grotesque wealth inequality, to be part of social movements to keep track of vicious patriarchal practices, to make sure we keep track of Muslims and Jews and Arabs and brown and yellow and so forth in terms of their human dignity here and around the world. And what does that mean? It means you have to be willing to accept a certain kind of vocation. And you don't know what the consequences of that vocation could be. Who knows? It could be another 1960s moment. You just don't know. Or we can be getting much deeper into the grimness as the neo-fascist stirrings increase, as the authoritarian populism increases, and Trump allows for big money, big military to continually increase. Speak to the workers as if he's in solidarity, even as he's calling for the kind of manufacturing units that for the most part have very little future in the kind of corporate globalization that is taking place. Even as the women begin to gain access, we shall see where they come down. There's a strong black caucus going back to 1972. How many of them became well-adjusted to injustice and didn't say a mumbling word about poverty for so long and begin to get so tied into Wall Street that they can't think about running for election without that Wall Street money, and therefore no critique of trying to regulate banks in any significant way, voting for repealing Glass-Steagall, another crucial act of the New Deal in the 1930s. These are the kind of issues that we're going to be talking about. And as you can imagine, for me, it's not in any way utilitarian or consequentialist calculation. There's no chance in hell that poor people or black people are ever going to be free. Still go down swinging with the same energy, same fire, because you want to be convinced, even given your critique of dogmatism, one's critique of forms of death, one's critique of domination. This is a desirable way of being in the world, regardless of what the circumstances are. The circumstances are better, lo and behold, you take off. That's why Bernie Sanders was so important. Rare to get that kind of discourse within mainstream, you see. But he had his own problems and challenges, you see. And where we end up, we don't know. We really don't know. A lot of people cannot conceive of the death of American democracy. I proceed on the notion that the death of American democracy is highly possible. Therefore, you need to fight more intensely to preserve the democratic possibility. And why can I conceive of the death of democracy as highly possible? Because for black folk, democracy was dead for 89 years under the U.S. Constitution as we were enslaved. It was for the most part dead for another 90 years under American terrorism and Jim Crow. So we know what it's like to live under the relative death of democratic practices as it relates to this side of the country, this side of town. And yet at our best, we said, ooh, we still have deep in our hearts and minds and souls this Socratic legacy, this prophetic legacy, this legacy of trying to give it a social analysis, and most importantly, a profound one of love such that you're willing to live and even die to see what possibilities are for the unborn. And that's just an echo of one's ancestors, one's grandparents that knew there was no real possibility for them, but say maybe the unborn can keep alive some sense of what American democracy looks like in the early and mid part of the 21st century. And is there any guarantee? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. The great Reinhold Niebuhr used to say democracy is an approximate solution to insoluble problems. What did he mean by that? Because he knew there are certain forms of death even democracy can't come to terms with, like your physical death, like your psychic death. All the democracy in the world not going to come to terms with your insecure psyche if you're not willing to work on it. And the same is true in terms of dogma, same is true in terms of domination. It's hard to conceive of a world that is domination free. So the best we have are strong mechanisms of accountability so that whatever structures of domination can be attenuated voice of those especially who have moral sensibility, or voice of those who are affected. And so in that sense, it's a grand tradition, but it's a very, very demanding one. And I think we need to be very, very cognizant of that. When you talk about really trying to sustain democratic projects, you're talking about one of the grand callings, really. Other parts of the world probably understand it even better. If you're in Turkey, if you're in Hungary, if you're in Brazil, if you're in Guatemala, and so forth, the challenges are even much more formidable. But lo and behold, in the United States, it's always been formidable for so many. And we'll see what we come up with. Definitely, we'll see what we come up with. We jump right in. Questions or queries, Brother Roberto or myself? Don't hesitate.
Yeah, it seems like there's a tension between keeping track of sort of the sins of our country and the domination of our country, and then on your side, vigorously moving towards the right economic project. And I think tension comes out when, sort of in the short term, there's white backlash when you try to raise some of the history that happens. And I'm wondering sort of how you try to resolve that tension, or is there a kind of a project that is inclusive of both of those kind of forces and ideas?
The assumption of the programmatic party is the formation of a trans-racial majority. A project for building class alliances and civil rights is not something different from defining the programmatic direction. They're the same thing. They're just the reverse side of each other. That's the point I made about Roosevelt's New Deal. It was a project that developed its own base as it went along. Now, it's not just an economic project. You call it an economic project. It's a project about everything, about education, about politics.
Right.
Philosophy and politics are the only two human activities that are about everything, and that when conducted at the highest level, demand everything, and that's why they're so worthy of human beings. But to be the possible project of a trans-racial majority, it has to face problems that are burning, that are controversial. Gave two examples in the fourth and fifth elements, not just the economic disputes, the inflation of race to class, it's the intervention in the conflict of moral agendas in the country. That's not what the progressives have done. They have not taken those risks, and they're not taking those risks. It's the reverse side of their absence of a programmatic vision. My central contention is that they have no project now. And that to have a project, having a project means having a structural project. And structural means, in the first instance, institutional. About the institutions, the transformation of institutions and the transformation of consciousness. The situation, not just in the United States, but in much of the world, is that the project of the progressives is the project of their conservative adversaries with a humanizing discount. Their project is to put a human face on the project of their adversaries. Now, what happens in any national life and in politics is that the force that commands the agenda is the force that most credibly embodies the cause of creative energy, of construction, of innovation. Not the force that comes afterwards to humanize what the energizers have done. So that's the fundamental problem in this programmatic dispute. And that's also where these sugarcoaters depart most significantly from the message of the American
I think, and of course, the overlap is that both of us believe that the neoliberal center cannot hold. And it's either going to be authoritarian populist with neo-fascist elements or a left populist with socialist elements. And to think that somehow the neoliberal center is the only alternative to hold back the enthusiasm, the waves, all of the mendacious narratives that galvanize our fellow citizens too often is a fatal mistake. So there is strong overlap there. But we started last week, as you recall, talking about history versus prophecy, memory versus futurity, and we both acknowledge both poles. But I'm just being honest in terms of the ways in which that past can circumscribe the lens through which we look at the present to try to create an alternative future. Does that make sense? Was there another hand? Yes. Go ahead.
I'm hoping either Professor Younger or you, Brother West, can speak more on the idea of a credit democracy and how that relates to individual freedom. So, as you all noted, wages have been stagnated over the last century. And to fill that gap for basic daily life, a lot of that has been filled by debt.
That's right.
Yeah, so how that relates to both individual pressures to make, for people in our position, more corporate or traditional decisions, or for those that are poorer to go into more like precarious financial arrangements, and maybe take a step back from like public or democratic engagement, things of that sort.
No, that's a very important question.
If I may,
Sure, jump right in.
just like to use this as an opportunity to explain the problem that we have in a programmatic argument. Because what I focused on in my remarks in the first half of the class were proximate steps in a redirection. But they're just the initial steps. And we have to look to the future to more radical. So, look, this is the problem we have now in the whole world, in a programmatic argument. If I say something that is far away from what exists, I or anyone, people will say, well, that's very interesting, but it's utopian. If I propose something that's close to what it is, they'll say it's feasible, but it's trivial. So, in the current view, almost anything that can be proposed is likely to seem either trivial or utopian. This dilemma, which threatens to paralyze the programmatic imagination, arises from a misunderstanding of the nature of programmatic arguments and transformative practice. They're not architecture, they're music. They're not about blueprints, they're about sequencing. And every sequence that is worth exploring can be described at a point close to what exists or far away from what exists. So the two most important attributes of a programmatic argument are first that it's market direction, and second that it selects in the historical circumstance the initial steps by which to move in that direction. Now, this problem is aggravated by a characteristic of the history of ideas. And the characteristic is that the contemporary social sciences and policy discourse have no structural insight, no way of talking about structural alternatives. Their whole tendency is to normalize or rationalize the existing arrangement. We did have a way of talking about structure in classical social theories like Marxism. The trouble is that that way is ensconced in a series of deterministic illusions. That there are systems like capitalism and feudalism, that each of them is indivisible, that there are laws governing their foreordained successors. That's all false. And it results in the binary view of politics that either you have the revolutionary substitution of one system by another, or you have the reformist management of the system. And that excludes the real character structural change in the world, which is fragmentary, but can nevertheless become radical in its outcome if it persists in a certain direction under certain conception. So, going back to your example with respect to capital and labor, you begin from where you are, in which you face a problem like the change in the character of the practice of production, the precarization of employment relations. You have to respond to it. But in responding to it, you have an anti-vision, a prefigurement of the direction that lies ahead. And in the direction that lies ahead, you would say, we don't want in the future, in the remote future, a world in which the dominant form of free labor remains economically dependent wage labor. Wage labor should give way to the higher forms of free labor, self-employment and cooperation. We don't want any human being to be condemned to do the work that could be done by machines. The machine should do what's repeatable so that we can do with machines what's not yet repeatable. Now, what happens in a programmatic argument is that when the premium is on conceptual clarity, it's best to choose a point that's neither very close to what exists, nor relatively far away from it, an intermediate point. Because that will reveal the direction we're clear. But that's no good in politics or in the language of persuasion, because this intermediate point, like the point I used in my discourse, is likely to seem too far away to be feasible, but too close to aroused enthusiasm. And therefore, in politics, we prefer